Since people enjoyed my Science of Superman video, I thought I would take some time to talk about this character's politics today. Superman has been around for a long time, and though often this character is sort of meant to be a bit apolitical and more all-American in his style and substance, there is a good amount of politics to Superman worth talking about. The most obvious example is around immigration. Superman is overtly pro-immigrant, basically being a refugee himself and going through a process not unlike most early immigrants to the United States, or even how a real-world refugee comes to America in present day. This isn't news or controversial either. This has been well established, and in some ways I kind of want to explore the politics of Superman beyond that because it's so well known. A lot has changed since Superman originally appeared and when he first came to represent those ideals. Modern immigration to this country is far more sophisticated than just showing up on a boat to Staten Island and being handed some papers. In Superman's case, the fundamentals aren't all that different. For a while, all you really had to do was just show up and you'd be an American. Nowadays, the process is really delayed actually, and quite elaborate in comparison. It's hard to imagine Superman would approve of most anti-immigrant rhetoric, or even the current politics around it, given his history and how important this issue is to him. Humanity took him in and adopted Kal-El as one of their own. That really means something for Superman, and it makes sense that he would never really be on the side of xenophobia in any form, even when it is humans directing it at other humans. Now, don't get me wrong, I can already imagine the conservative counterpoints forming against this. Superman would indeed not approve of all cases of illegal immigration. For example, if somebody was a violent criminal Superman has to stop, and they were an illegal immigrant, I don't think he would have a problem with turning them over to the authorities for deportation. If the process were a little more just as it currently existed and a little more expedited, Superman would probably be against illegal immigration altogether. On the other hand, no, he's not going to come across a family of illegal immigrants struggling to get food and shout at them, "Go home!" That's just not in this character. He might make efforts to get his family citizenship or legally settled so that they might get a more stable job, something along those lines. But he's not going to just return people to a war-torn nation to fend for themselves just because the government wants it that way. These are all just consistent aspects of his character and what we've seen of him. We see a lot of this in situations where, say, Lex Luthor takes over as president. Superman might have his own innate sense of justice that doesn't always mesh with the law, so he's not going to go out of his way to enforce any legislation he doesn't agree with or cooperate with the authorities when they are being ridiculous. Yet I wouldn't go so far as to say Superman has no regard for law and order either, nor is he exactly interested in making waves enough to fully challenge this political system as it exists. So Luthor basically got to be president so long as he was legally allowed to, but Superman was willing to push against that here and there. We have seen a Kal-El that doesn't respect this, when he decides to enforce his political will on the human race, and because he is so enormously powerful, few can or even really want to oppose this being. Generally, these Supermen are represented in stuff like Injustice or the Crime Syndicate, and it is never pretty. Superman can't and probably shouldn't be forcing people to do the right thing when the power imbalance between him and the human race is so severe. It's the kind of idea explored in comics like Superman vs. the Elite, which we've covered on this channel before. Superman wants what is best for humanity, but overtly using violence and intimidation to accomplish that isn't really us growing, learning, or maturing as a society and species. It's forcing us into something we obviously wouldn't be ready for otherwise, and any system built on this is inevitably relying on Superman's power to sustain it. Think about the regime in Injustice that immediately falls apart when Superman is defeated. People are mostly obeying Superman because they knew they had to. The same usually goes for Ultraman and the Crime Syndicate. Unless you're a superhero, there is pretty much nothing you can do about it whatsoever. So you have this system in place where Superman is in charge, makes all the decisions, has no real accountability, and can't be stopped. When a Superman like that disappears from the equation, of course people are going to stop following the system in place. It's a fun fantasy and discussion in political science to talk about a benevolent dictator. The Injustice Superman, or worse, Ultraman, are poor examples of that. But what if Superman actually were just trying to force everyone to do their best and be good, peaceful humans? Who's deciding what is right or wrong here? Well, it's Superman. So what is Superman's opinion on abortion? How would he deal with the American healthcare system, or automation? I think Kal-El, in all his iterations, would have opinions on these matters. But the Superman we are most familiar with largely keeps these opinions to himself and doesn't get involved with these kind of politics in the public sphere. Because yes, while he might have opinions on what he thinks is right, intervening on stuff like that is a bit of another matter. It is one thing for Superman to stop a man with a gun, it is another to stop a man from buying a gun. Looking at all the shootings in America, I have my opinions on what might work for that, but I'm divided on the matter. I think gun ownership is actually a great way to protect yourself from certain situations, like right-wing terrorism, for example. So yes, we'll have ideas on what America can do to improve the situation. I definitely feel a different way when it comes to forcing America to do these ideas, let alone the rest of the world. And then we get into the enforcement itself. What does it look like when this enforcement can obliterate anything, resist anyone, and outpace average humans on every level, including lifespan? That's not a dictator, that's a god, and a particularly malevolent one, even if it is trying to do the right thing. Instead, perhaps thankfully, most versions of Kal-El seem to shape themselves up as a bit of a safety net for the human race, picking them up when they trip and fall, and maybe even politely reminding them to fix the crack in the cement that caused the whole incident, but otherwise leaving it to humans to actually decide whether or not they should do anything. For many, that might feel or seem inadequate. By most standards around the world, Superman is pretty much a centrist, though one that would probably lean at least pretty consistently left by American standards these days. I don't really think that's all too controversial either by the standards of the geopolitical landscape of the world. I've always seen it as Superman being a little more liberal towards Batman's more conservative inclinations, though that political divide and those differences made a lot more sense when America was not hyper-polarized as it is today. American politics are weird, and as such it feels like Superman would be pretty consistently voting Democrat based on everything we just covered, right? But in the rest of the world, he'd probably be more privately in favor of and voting for politicians like Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, or Justin Trudeau. Pretty much only one country in the Western world would view any of these politicians as substantially left-wing, if we're being truly honest and not drinking the far-right Kool-Aid known as Russian disinformation systematically spread around the world. For those wondering where Superman's politics might fall on the eastern side of the world, well, that's a very different conversation. Red Sun explores this well, as a Superman that grew up in Soviet Russia, for example, is just a fundamentally different character with a different perspective on things than the ones that grow up in Kansas. The same could be said for a Superman that landed in China, India, the Middle East, Central Africa, and even South America. It would be interesting to explore that a bit more in alternate comics, but I feel like that's a very different discussion, and we would have to look country by country to really get what kind of character would emerge out of that story. It's neat to think about, though. Instead, I want to circle back to Superman's demeanor and attitude towards politics as they are, because to me, it's both a bit of a character flaw and a limitation to what Superman can or is comfortable doing. Yet also something I sort of admire and really like about him, too. It makes him less boring that he has this very human trait of fighting for justice but not really being cognizant or that combative of the larger systems of injustice in place around him. For example, Superman might readily be able to face a dangerous criminal, but only can really do so much in addressing mental health, poverty, and harm reduction, the very factors that likely created said criminal. In the world of fiction, where you want stakes, character flaws, and conflict, this is all a good thing to me. It is good that Superman is not perfect. It is positive he has this secret flaw, and Superman's stories involve him not being able to be everywhere and save everyone. And like I said, there's something admirable about it all too. It's cool there's a character who can crack a planet open with his bare fists, consistently showing restraint politically. It's cool you have this character who can crack a planet open with his bare fist, consistently showing restraint politically. Even when his worst enemy became the head of state, Superman did not stop the man from taking power, Lex Luthor was elected, and it was, at the time, what the American people wanted. As easy as it is to imagine Superman disagreeing with a great deal of things an extremist like, say, the 45th President of the United States might believe, it is equally hard to imagine Superman doing much about it other than making a couple of choice statements in front of a camera here and there. I find something like that very realistic. A lot of people are like that in the world, and Superman kind of represents that particular political attitude in my mind. It is admirable in that Superman is showing a certain optimism and a belief that the arc of history bends towards justice, but it also is a bit flawed in its reasoning. Justice doesn't really happen over time. It has always been the result of blood, sweat, and tears. People need to work at it, advocate for it, and fight for what is right, often over the course of years or even generations. There's a lot of focus on magic and kryptonite being these big weaknesses for Superman, but this kind of inaction, complacency, or just inability to address these issues is a flaw too. It provokes a lot of interesting questions. Where and when does Superman intervene? Where does this line exist? What does he do when someone is starving? Does he take food from somebody else? He's a journalist, there's no way he can afford to pay for it, but it also is hard to imagine him ignoring a starving child, who could very well be pleading directly to Superman for aid, and we know that he likely hears that all the time while on Earth. What about in the case of famine, where a whole country needs food? Where is he going to get the resources to help with that? Because those resources do exist, but who is he taking that from? At what point does this go too far and Superman just becomes a sort of high-powered version of Robin Hood? I don't have an answer to any of these questions, but I think it's a very interesting side of this character worth exploring more in the comics in the future. And I'm curious what everyone's thoughts are on it, so feel free to share them in the comments. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching, everybody. Obviously this might be a hot button issue for some people or whatever, but you know, it's just a fun discussion. It's just my thoughts kind of organized a little bit around the different political aspects of Superman I find interesting. And like I said, there's aspects to this I just have questions for more than answers and anything like that. So by all means, I'd love to hear people's thoughts and opinions on what I've said and discussed here in the comments section below. Like, do you agree? Do you think Superman would kind of lean in this direction that I'm talking about? What do you think of the US and its Overton window? There's a lot of discussions I had here. I'll try and remember, because I'm sure in my edit I'm going to include a lot of articles and stuff like that, kind of referencing what I was talking about here. So I will include those if you want to read some more. I feel like I touched on a lot of different issues that, you know, I'm well versed in politically at this point. But if you are unsure about or were confused by, I definitely have things you can read further about it. So yeah, that's it. Thanks a lot for watching, everyone, for checking it out. I do have a lot of ideas for exploring more characters and the science around them, or the politics, the philosophy. Really any field of academia can be used to take apart these characters and look at them in a different angle. So if you have any ideas for that, or something you want to see me cover, by all means, please let me know as well. Thanks again, everyone, and I'll see you next time on Comic Island.